days you work, one whole day to play. Come on, everybody, wear your roller skates today. It's Saturday, 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 it's Saturday, Saturday, it's Saturday, Saturday, it's Saturday,
Saturday with Renee. Yes, welcome back, everybody, to Black Liberation Media and episode 140 of uninterrupted, I should say, episodes of Saturdays with Renee, featuring Renee Johnston. I'm Jared Ball. We have a very special guest joining us as a co-host today, Mtume Gant, who will be with us when our actual guest shows up in a little bit. But so like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon, do all the things. And Renee and Mtume, how you feel? How you both feeling today?
Tired, you know, that life, that parent organizing life.
We really need to do like a parent organizer episode. Actually, I've been saying it for a while because the whole parenting thing is a real struggle. Like when you're trying to do things, but you have a little person that like requires you to eat, like it's a thing. Like it's a legit thing that I don't know if everybody really. I don't know if you're not a parent in this situation, if you fully understand how difficult it is to be a parent and an organizer simultaneously. And yours is little.
Yeah.
Mine's in between. Jared's in an empty house and about to be, but like.
And I decided to have a kid in my 40s, man.
Yeah, salute to you. I don't know. Nope. By the way, people can't see Renee, but I have to say this because I saw Renee before we started the show. And I just want to point out that Mtume didn't get the memo and is the only one not wearing a red shirt today. So I thought we were all on point with the color scheme, given the. Okay, there you go. All right, let Cuba live. All right. That he did.
My Marxism is tight.
Yeah. But if you're not in the right color scheme, it don't matter. It's all about the proper.
My bad.
It's all about the look and the uniform. It's not about the substance. Didn't you read the book we're talking about today?
Aesthetics.
It's the aesthetics.
Right.
Oh man, yeah. And yes, I saw that too. That Black Miss hosted Gabriel just yesterday. And
so can I just tell you, I purposely didn't watch it because so at first I was like, maybe I'll watch it so that I can make sure we don't like, double talk stuff. And then I was like, I don't want to spoil what I have in my head by watching him with two. I had a real debate about it. And then in the end, I decided not to watch it, to have my 3 pages of written notes and my 2 pages of typed notes.
I just didn't have time. I've been, in addition to reading as much of the book as I possibly could, and I admit I didn't get to everything, but I've been consuming a lot of Rockhill's interviews, including yours and Mtume and several others that have been very helpful. So I would have watched had I had the time, but I'll check it out later. And in many cases, for people like me, at least, to the extent that there's overlap and repetition, it's necessary, because there's a lot that Rockhill gets to that is unfamiliar to me, in terms of some of the details, and even reading the book as I'm consuming these interviews has been, there's just a lot that would require revisiting. And that's why we like to remind people reading and studying are not the same thing. So I think that's also just important as well to consider. But yeah. So, but I'm glad that Rockhill is making the rounds, as they say, because I think a lot of what is there is, to me, essential.
Yeah. This was, and you know what? Rather than doing the weird, like talking about him in the third person when I'm looking at him behind stage, maybe we just like bring Gabriel up.
Well, I will. So I was waiting. I wanted to make sure that we got through any other the preamble that there was, but I did see in Old Greece. Thank you for the super chat, and also this first point, because this is something I saw, and I think this is a great segue to bring Gabriel up. I happened to have seen the same movie, saw the same scene, and had a similar reaction to the line where Old Greece says, "I've been wondering that question ever since that bit." Oh, because I titled the I think it's in response to the way I titled the show, Marxism versus Communism ? So I've been wondering that question ever since that bit in Triangle of Sadness, pretty good movie, where Woody Harrelson says, quote, "I'm not a communist, I'm a Marxist." And I had the same kind of reaction, like, what are we really trying to say? And having read Gabriel's book a little bit, I'm like, all right, so maybe we can endeavor and answer that, and we'll bring Gabriel Rockhill to the stage, and welcome. And good to see you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. Great to see all of you.
Peace, Gabriel.
I'm super excited for this, and I am a consumer at the last minute of books because I like for it to be fresh as I'm like reading and taking my notes. So I literally finished it this morning. Literally.
Well, as my kids say about their homework, if you leave it to the last minute, it only takes a minute.
You know what? That's a good one. I'll have to remember that. But
their dad disagrees with them, but
but so the audience understands this has been in the works for weeks and weeks and weeks. We had like a list of books that I was trying to get to, and I didn't want to get to this conversation without having read the book. So we pushed it out as much as we could. Also, because as everyone who follows your show knows, we've been doing a lot of conversations with Luna Oy, with Alchemy, with Ntume, going through dialectic materialism, talking about Lenin, Marx, like all of these things. And I, in my mind, have this real dream of pulling all of these people, including Dwayne Monroe and Samantha Youssef and, Lara Shiha, everybody who's trying to figure out how do we really get our audience to understand why it's so important to recognize all of these triggers that are out in the world, right? And to understand how all of these things are playing with our brains as we're trying to walk through this world of capitalism. And I don't really know how I'm gonna make this happen, but this is the dream, right? Like that eventually all of these people will be able to like come up with a plan, no matter how small or big of a plan it is, that we can share and talk through with each other and with the broader audience that we all share, to make sure that folks are like working towards the things that we need people to be working towards, so that we can have an actual revolutionary strategy towards improving the material conditions of all people, right? And so first, Gabriel, thank you so much for joining. Ntume, thank you for being the bridge that allowed this to happen. I think everybody knows Ntume, so I don't know if we need to do a brief one for you, but Gabriel, if you don't mind, we like to start with allowing our guests to do the who, what, where, who you are, where you came from, and how you got here, and then we can start talking about all the other things.
So I'm a philosopher who believes that interpreting the world is only a path to ultimately transforming it. And I direct the Critical Theory Workshop, an educational nonprofit. I also teach at Villanova University. And I've written a number of books. The one we're going to talk about on Western Marxism is the first in a trilogy. And there's actually a book coming out next month that's a co-authored book with Émeric Monville that's called Requiem for French Theory, that picks up on a lot of the themes in this book, but pushes it more in the direction of the effects of postmodernism, not only on the intellectual world, but of course, most importantly, on the broader organizing world and the kind of cultural complex that has promoted postmodernism and in various ways, shapes, and forms, identity politics, certain forms of wokeness, etc. And so that's at least a quick introduction, but I'd be happy to follow up with more details if you have questions.
I somehow missed that you work at Villanova. I don't know how that like missed me completely. But
Yeah, I've actually been there for almost 20 years now,
wow,
which is crazy. Yeah, but that's, I guess, how time passes.
interesting. I'll have to send you the name of some of my students that I've sent to Villanova to see if
Oh,
you know any of them.
'cause yeah, no, that would be great. We have a small but vibrant community, and we had the pleasure of having Mtume down at Villanova, and everybody should know that the Society for Peace, Internationalism, and Ecology, which Mtume attended and presented at the inaugural conference, is going to take place again this coming October. And it is an association not only of intellectuals, but also organizers and artists. And so if you haven't seen the call, check it out. If you just want to come and attend, do. It's a great time to come to Villanova.
Very cool. So I've got a lot because this is my MO. I don't like I tend to read and take notes and write questions and all these things. And I know you and Ntume had a previous conversation, which I did listen to. And in fact, that was what prompted me to say, Ntume, can you figure out how we can like build this bridge so we can have this additional conversation? So I don't know, Ntume, Jared, if you have anything in particular that you wanted to start with before I got into you all. Hopefully, see, this is also the curse of my life, Gabriel, right? So these two were like, what are we doing? And so I took all this time, I created a document, I typed everything out. I have no idea if either one of them looked at anything that's on that document.
I looked. I definitely looked.
So you're obviously the opposite of my kids who are leaving their homework to the last minute, right? Actually, that comment didn't land. You're much more like me, what people refer to as a belt and suspenders kind of guy. You know, you always want to have the plan and the backup plan. So I appreciate that, Renee.
It's the goal. So I may have finished it this morning, but it was the culmination. It's because of how I do it, right? It's intentionally fresh. It's an intentional wait until you have to, you're about to talk. So everything's, getting done here.
Yeah.
Plus I'm always reading like 3 and 4 books at the same time, which sometimes makes it a little bit crazy in this brain of mine. But Ntume, did you have anything you wanted to start with, Jared?
I mean, to start with, you have anything, Jab, you want to start with?
I have, like everybody, I'm sure, a lot of things to want to discuss. But if the only thing that I thought would maybe that I have that I wanted to address that might be good to offer up now is a question around methodology. Not only what were your goals with the book, but I've in reading it and then hearing you talk a lot about it, I am very much interested in the methods that you employed, including the time it took. But other than that, I'm happy to follow leads and jump in where I fit in. Yeah.
Can I add, because that actually was one of the questions that I actually have for Gabriel also, because you talk about like dialectical hermeneutics, you bring in these like different kind of concepts, and I think for the book there is an analysis style that leaves bourgeois analysis, right? And I think that's something that I think is really important. So kind of attaching to Jab's question, I want to talk about the process, but also the methodology and the tools of the trade that you were really working with in this.
Well, I have my own formal training in the bourgeois humanities and social sciences, and in critically reflecting on the limits of those methodologies over the course of decades because of my training, it became increasingly apparent to me the limitations of what we can simplistically say, and this is just an oversimplification for the sake of the conversation, that a lot of what you're trained in the bourgeois humanities is internal analysis of cultural products. So you look at the texts, you don't look at the context, or you look at the works of art, but not how they were materially produced, etc. The bourgeois social sciences tends to overcome those limitations to a certain extent insofar as they'll situate cultural products and intellectual production within a broader world, but they tend to be framed in such a way that the world is divided up into autonomous spheres, and there's not a clear positioning of cultural production within the social totality, and very specifically within the political economy of cultural production. and distribution. And of course, both the bourgeois humanities and social sciences, because they are ultimately a product of a capitalist system of knowledge production, are in the service of shoring up a worldview that maintains capitalist social relations. And there's, of course, a million different ways of doing this, including being critical of capitalism, but saying that what overcomes capitalism is worse than capitalism itself, right? So it doesn't mean that you don't have critiques. It just means that the breadth and depth of these critiques is often hemmed in. And so in my own approach, I drew obviously very extensively on the dialectical and historical materialist tradition, perhaps first and foremost to overcome the limitations of the bourgeois humanities and social sciences, and to instead situate the subjective, cultural, and intellectual production of particular works within the broader system of material relations of cultural and intellectual production and distribution. In short, neither internal analysis nor external analysis, because both of these kind of reify one pole of that opposition, either the cultural product itself or the context understood in quite a restricted sense as you get it in the bourgeois social sciences. Moreover, the dialectical and historical materialist tradition is holistic in nature. It recognizes that one of the reasons that the bourgeoisie has divided knowledge is precisely in order to fragment the broader world so that we cannot apprehend it and see it as a constitutive totality, right? And so you can't separate, I mean, come on, right? Especially in our day and age, you're going to separate economics from politics, from society, from the study of nature and the environment. I mean, anybody who's paying any attention to the world knows full well that all of these form a holistic part. And so one of the goals of a dialectical hermeneutics is just a fancy term for interpretation that's often used kind of in philosophic circles. It's how we interpret cultural and intellectual production. And dialectical hermeneutics is never satisfied with the internal analysis that you get in the bourgeois humanities or this external analysis in the social sciences, but instead it dialectically situates subjective production. So you take an individual set of philosophic works, for instance, and you situate them within the material relations within which they were produced, the overall system that is, of course, economic, political, social, etc. And in doing so, you recognize that there's a play of forces between subjective agency and the conditions operative within that overall system. So you also don't kind of reduce the agency of subjects to a totalizing and determining system, nor do you do the opposite of that and act as if, well, there's just free individuals who make up any kind of cultural production that they want and the system of determinants is inoperative. Instead, you tease out the ways in which material conditions structure the lived world, the life world and the environment of cultural producers, while those cultural producers make decisions in relationship to those conditions. And all of this kind of organic relationship between subject and system then changes over time, right? So it's not just that you have a subject who acts once and for all, but they act, and as they act, also the system is changing. And so the goal of dialectical hermeneutics is to cohere much more closely to the complexity of the material world of intellectual and cultural production than these kind of reified and abstract models that you get in a lot of the bourgeois approaches to knowledge production. The last thing that I'd say is, of course, the most important, and the thing that I kind of left aside is that this is not only an intellectual endeavor, right? The reason for engaging in an analysis of the social totality that dialectically situates subjects within it is precisely in order to give us the theoretical framework necessary for understanding the structural forces operative in a particular world, and most importantly, how to change that world, right? So a lot of my work is an analysis of ideology in its materialist sense. And it aims at giving us the tools necessary for combating the dominant ideology and thereby actually maximizing our agency, so that we're not just conditioned by the system to think and act in particular ways, but we're able to understand how that system has an impact on us, and we can leverage our own power within it to liberate us, at least to some extent, from that overall system of constraints.
So, thank you. But I was reminded in the chat that we didn't say what the title of the book was or tell anybody what the book was about. Which I take, because I get so excited. I'm like, let's just go. So if not to put aside anything that you just said, because I have a lot of it leads to a lot of the questions that I have written down and some of the thoughts as I was reading through the book. But could you just do a brief, like, who the title of the book, everyone, is Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism? And Gabriel Rockhill is the author of the work. And if you could, Gabriel, give everybody kind of a, like a brief, this is what I'm trying to do in this book. And so
I'm sorry, can I?
No, go ahead. Sure.
Just before you do, I want to jump in because I was only corrected in this by hearing someone else make this point in a previous interview with Gabriel. Because I've been making the same mistake. And I blame whoever arranged this on the cover, but the proper first part of the title is too small. The Intellectual World War: Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism? So I just wanted to add that part in there because I think that's a very important part of what I understand to be supposed to be part of the title. So anyway, that said, yeah, go ahead.
I appreciate that, Jared. The reason we made it so small is that The Intellectual World War is actually the title of the trilogy, of which this is the first book. And I'll explain that just quickly. So Who Paid the Pipers of Western Marxism is in part echoing the title Who Paid the Piper, a book by Francis Donner Saunders that engaged in extensive archival research to demonstrate that the US national security state and the capitalist ruling class through its foundations were engaged not simply in the funding and promotion of the non-communist left and cultural production that accommodated capitalism and even imperialism, but that these operations, in the words of you, Wilford, were likely the greatest intercession in the world of art and culture in the history of humanity, meaning that the amount of resources that we're talking about boggle the imagination. But my own focal point then is in the first half of the book, I try to outline the overall architecture in and around the US national security state for shoring up the dominant forms of ideology that they wanted to promote in the early Cold War. So it's a kind of deep dive into the frameworks and organizations that were established for the psychological warfare operations targeting communism. The second half of the book, and this explains the second half of the title, focuses more specifically on the form of Marxism that has become predominant within the imperial core and that it is common to refer to as Western Marxism. As I explain in the book, I prefer the term imperial Marxism, but this is a kind of Marxism that is largely academic, disconnected from class struggle, and tends to accommodate capitalism and be openly opposed to communism. So this first book basically provides in two parts an account of the propaganda apparatus of the US state and capitalist ruling class, and then a critical reflection on the promotion of a form of Marxism as a weapon of war against anti-imperialist Marxism, or what is ultimately just Marxism tout court, or Marxism in its true sense, or what some people call Global South Marxism. It's Marxism that's dedicated to actually changing the world, not just misinterpreting it as the imperial Marxists are. And then, Jared, just to address this very quickly, so the Intellectual World War is really looking at the war not only on the practice of actually existing socialism, but the very idea of the capacity of human beings to develop an alternative social and economic system The second volume will be out in early 2027. I'm just completing the proofs now. It's called French Theory Made in USA, and it looks at the impact of postmodern French theory, which was supported by the Ford Foundation, the capitalist ruling class, the Rockefellers as well, and was recognized as an ally in the anti-communist intellectual world war by the Central Intelligence Agency. And the final volume is called Radical Theories, Infantile Disorder, and it addresses a question that's often brought up regarding my scholarship, and that is, well, what about the grand radical theorists of today? Aren't you talking just about the Cold War and things in the past? And what I'll demonstrate in this third volume, which I already have a draft of, is that these systems and structures are very much alive and well. If people are familiar with an essay that I wrote on Slavoj Žižek, this forms part of this third volume, where I demonstrate that Žižek is very much the epitome of an imperial Marxist, in the sense that he's opposed to and actually played a direct practical role in dismantling actually existing socialism in the former Yugoslavia, and is now one of the kind of leaders of an imperial Marxist obfuscation project that is presenting China as a fascist country, which is really bonkers, unless you're working, for the State Department, or you're doing State Department propaganda work without getting paid directly by the State Department. In any case, Zizek's orientation is, I think, very clear in that regard.
So you just led me to one of my main questions. And so thank you for that. I'm very much looking forward to continuing on this path alongside as you release books. I'm also, the petty side of me is very much looking forward to who else you call out in the third book, because I feel like that is a major problem. And it's why
but keep doing it, because Zizek got me, God damn it. I have to claim that. I got 10, 15 years ago, whenever I got. So,
I feel your pain. No, I feel as I explained in that article and in my own work, this is also a project of self-critique. I come through this from the inside originally as someone who's duped. But the goal of this critique is not simply to say, well, Zizek's wrong or Judith Butler's wrong, or point out individual cases. This is important, but ultimately it's the entire system that got us, Jared, right? It's the entire system of intellectual production that produced Zizek and promoted him in the first place, and will continue to promote him and others of his ilk, right? And that's what we have to be attentive to, is ideology's chameleonic, takes on many different shapes and forms, but the material structures that produce that ideology, if we can understand them, then we can really get to the core of matters. So I, absolutely share your sense of, being duped, but not wanting to be fooled again.
Well,
exactly.
And this is something that, as I was reading,
I'm sorry. He said, what he say? If you fool me once, can't get fooled. How did Bush mess that up back in the day? If you fool me once, if you fool me, can't get fooled. Anyway, sorry about that.
So this idea of the space that is created intentionally by empire and the system, so that we can be provided with these rare moments of, look at these people who are trying to do this thing that's actually against the system, which is how we get got, right? Because it's an intentional space that's created. People fill the space, and then you're trying to determine and decipher, like, who's there in earnest, who's there because the empire let them be there, who's there, and it creates a very messy. It just creates a very messy problem where you are consistently trying to determine who is worthy of being listened to, because they're actually there to provide resources and to give information, and who's actually there so that there can be this representation that there are these forces that are, within the system that are trying to fight the system. This is my constant battle, right? And we talk a lot here about naming the enemy. I love the context of the intellectual labor aristocracy. I was like, whoo, that's it.
The military industrial academic complex.
I have
That's
that
another good
written
one.
down. I have this idea.
Got a lot of them.
Oh, so many. They police the left border of critique, which I was like, oh, that's unbelievable. I actually literally have a note that says this whole paragraph is fucking bars, because everything that you go through as you're talking about this space and the way these people into the space, they're being paid by the system, upheld by the system, and their role is literally to give people just enough that they think there's something that they're doing, but never enough to actually move forward towards social, like the actual change that's necessary. So I'm wondering, like, do you have any thoughts on how can people learn to make this distinction, and if that's even possible to learn to make that distinction?
I appreciate that question. I would say that it is true that things are messy in the precise sense that within a capitalist system, people do need to survive, and that the politics of purity that would assume that an individual can make a perfect set of choices and somehow not be, not necessarily even complicit, but connected to a system that is highly compromised, that I think is largely mythological. And so if we approach this dialectically and we situate all subjects within the overall system, if you're working in the United States or within the imperial core, you're within a capitalist system. Intellectuals in particular do need quite a high level of material support in order to do their work successfully. And therefore, the objective of my research isn't to say, for instance, anyone who ever got a Ford grant or taught at a corporate university or went on to a conference and later found out it was funded by X source is compromised, and therefore we should kind of tar and feather them. I don't think that the best approach to this is a kind of moralizing approach of just identifying individuals and condemning them and lining up another group of individuals and saying, well, these are all the great individuals. That said, I am not trying to skirt the question, because I think you're really getting to the core of matters. You can recognize the complexities of what it is that we're dealing with, avoid things like simple guilt by association or moralism and things like this, while at the same time really keeping very clear at least two important things that I'll highlight. One is what I consider to be the single most important line of demarcation in intellectual and theoretical global class struggle. That is whether or not you clearly articulate or you try to obfuscate or deny the fundamental structure of global capitalism that is organizing human life on planet Earth, which is imperialism, which in short means the subordination of the overwhelming majority of the peoples of this world to the financial ruling class in the global north in order to steal or take at a pittance land, natural resources, labor, and then use them for markets, right? That is what is structuring the world that we live in for the most part. That line of demarcation is equally important, because the way you fight imperialism is not by coming up with some new words or new gestures or just writing a fancy book on the topic. The way you do it is by getting organized in a coherent manner in order to leverage sectors of the global population out of the imperialist death grip. And the most successful way of doing that we've discovered thus far on planet Earth is socialist state building projects. Therefore, that line of demarcation is the thinkers that we're engaging with. Are they clarifying the structures of global imperialism in spite of debates? Because of course there are debates, disagreements, etc. That's all welcome. Not everybody has to agree on everything, but you have to recognize the basics for the beginning of a serious scholarly engagement. And you also have to take seriously the advances of actually existing socialism, while of course factoring in setbacks, contradictions, mistakes, etc. If you don't do that, then you're doing the work of empire in the sense that you're obfuscating the material relations of global class struggle, and you're not providing people with a clear understanding of how you fight and win against the imperial system. So that's one kind of large structural issue. The other thing that I would say is more at an individual level. If you're reading authors, listening to them give talks or things like this, one very good litmus test is to ask yourself the question of whether or not they are engaged in a theoretical practice that is focused on the use value of knowledge. Are they trying to communicate clearly, engage in a good faith manner, share ideas, participate in a collective tradition of elucidation? Or are they primarily committed to exchange value because they have their own idiosyncratic vocabulary, their own system of ideas, and a whole series of cultural commodities that they market as absolutely unique and push as a way of promoting their own career? Clearly, people like Michael Parenti, Walter Rodney, Samir Amin, and others are invested in the use value. And clearly, those like Theodore Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, people like this, they're in the other camp. And so that, at least, I think, is a starting point, because, of course, Renee, these are not easy issues, and we could have an endless conversation about certain things. Actually, let me just add one final thing, and that is that given how dialectical analysis operates, we're always trying to get our mind as close as possible to the complexities of the world. And so we do have to recognize that even within the work of figures who we would greatly respect, there are mistakes that can be made and corrected over time. And so we really have to be attentive to the gray zone and not just assume that there's kind of an absolute purity of black and white, at least in certain cases. In other cases, there are, but there are examples that I could point to, even in, of course, in my own work. A lot of my early work, I was kind of generally materialist, but I didn't really grasp the core aspects of imperialism and the fight against it. And I would be the first person to be self-critical in that regard. Well, I don't think that all of my early work should just, was not either helpful at a certain materialist level, and it wasn't part of a broader project of self-clarification, right? So I think we need to be able to see those types of complexities rather than just traffic in a kind of moralism that's more about I'm right, they're wrong, as opposed to the collective project of, well, what's useful in moving us forward, because that's the ultimate goal.
So there's actually something I would like to jump in on. Another bar that I've been using is cultural commodity fetishism. I think that's another one of your great interventions here. And I would like to think about this in two parts. A, maybe explain what you mean by that practice, what it does to theory. But the other thing you do is you really get into the foundation work. And, I think I said this to you when we talked, Gabriel, amongst the black folk, for a long time, we always talk about, who be giving this money? Who are these people, right? And then there's great texts like Robert Allen's Black Awakening and Capitalist America, where he talks about the Ford Foundation. And we see how these foundations really, they emphasize this kind of cultural commodity fetishism. So I would love for you to talk, maybe describe what you mean by that, but also that foundation work and why you think it's important for them to push that kind of narrative or that kind of work or those kinds of, exhibits, so forth and so on.
So commodity fetishism, as Marx elucidates it, is the ways in which commodities take on this talisman-like charm. They're personified, right? Things act like people or like spiritual beings, and they're severed from their social relations of production. So we see the commodity and are enchanted by it, but we don't see the labor that goes into it, the extractivism, all of the social relations that produce that commodity. And part of the Marxist critical project is to break with commodity fetishism by revealing all of the blood, sweat, tears, and ecological destruction that has gone into the production of commodities. I've just expanded, or not necessarily expanded, I've mobilized the concept of commodity fetishism to try to elucidate very clearly how this operates within the cultural and intellectual sphere, where cultural commodities or intellectual commodities are subjected to the same basic process, right? They're severed from their social relations of production, and then they become these enchanted goods, these kind of sacred cows that we could never call into question. I know full well that when I was first introduced in my college years to French theory, I can still remember the semiotext books, or the books like the Baudrillard books. If anybody remembers the covers of a lot of Jean Baudrillard books, right? They're highly seductive commodities that, of course, are severed from the social relations of production. They just want us to kind of fall in love with the commodity and then consume it almost thoughtlessly, which is, of course, what I was doing at the time. And what a lot of this does then is it gives us a false understanding of how culture actually works. And so cultural commodity fetishism is very integral to bourgeois cultural production in general. Because if the commodity of culture just exists on its own, and it's the product almost always of an absolute genius who has produced it, almost out of nothing, then we're never encouraged to ask the question of where these commodities come from, who's paying for them, who's promoting them, what other forms of cultural production are these commodities invisibilizing, masking, discrediting, etc. And so cultural commodity fetishism is a really integral aspect of bourgeois culture in general. Now, from a dialectical and historical materialist perspective, we always have to materially situate cultural production and ask all of these difficult questions, which have to do with the political economy of cultural production and distribution. So I think that one thing that is very important among intellectuals and cultural producers more generally is whether or not they're attentive to this. Just harping back to the kind of earlier question, right? And this is also thinking because M2A and I have talked a lot about third cinema and certain forms of cinematic production that are very attentive to the modes of production and that introduce alternative modes of production in order to enhance their agency so they're not just captured by the studio apparatus. What this reveals is a kind of dialectical and historical materialist sensibility to how the control of property and the means of production has an impact on the type of intellectual and cultural work that's being produced, right? Brecht was one of the best at doing this, right? Always asking the question of who owns the means of cultural production and what impact is it having on the culture that we're producing. So this would be just another kind of litmus test for the thinkers and cultural producers that we're looking at. Are they just producing culture, or are they reflecting at a meta level on the material system of production within which they're operating? And are they identifying strategies to push back against it, not only individually, but often also by producing alternative modes of intellectual production and distribution? I'll give a shout out to all of you for all of the important podcast work that you're doing, which is a testament to the type of work that is necessary to put the means of communication, distribution of knowledge more squarely in the hands of the people. Obviously, we have to navigate things, like tech platforms that are owned by the ruling class, but we can, as much as possible, use those to our own ends. And so tying this back to the foundation complex, it is extremely important that one of the ways in particular that you get in the US model of bourgeois culture for funding and supporting culture and making it look autonomous is to have that funding channeled through foundation networks so that one can say, well, we don't receive any government funding. We just receive the funding from the financial ruling class that owns the state, that doesn't fund us directly because we're getting funded by the way in which the financial ruling class has twice embezzled their funds. Once they've stolen it from the workers And then secondly, they haven't given it to the government in a form of taxation. They've put it within their foundations so that they can then use those funds to target the forms of cultural production that they want to promote. And so the foundations are a big part of the way in which culture is manipulated within the bourgeois world, because we all know full well that if you want to make a blockbuster film, if you want to make a bestseller novel, if you want to sell 300,000 copies of your book, then having foundation, backing, and support makes an enormous difference. And for the financial ruling class, we have to remember, this is peanuts. For them, leveraging this is a very small amount of their overall portfolio. And so for us to understand how cultural production operates, we have to be attentive to all of these forces, because ultimately the goal should be to maximize our agency and also our effectiveness in reaching people and getting our message across, and detailing how the foundation network is a way of basically manipulating culture while making it appear as if it's free. I'll just conclude on one example, and that is that the Congress for Cultural Freedom, arguably the largest front organization run by the Central Intelligence Agency, between about 1950 and 66 when it began to be revealed, but then they repackaged it and continued it into the 70s. This was a project that explicitly presented itself as a project aimed at defending the freedom of cultural producers everywhere from the big bad Soviet state-driven control, purportedly, of cultural production. And it was revealed, of course, not only that the Central Intelligence Agency was founding it, but so was Ford, so was Rockefeller. And after it was revealed that the agency was involved in 66, who took over all the funding? Ford. And Ford, of course, has a liaison and works hand in glove with the Central Intelligence Agency on an innumerable number of operations. So what we have here is simply a kind of corporate state shell game, right? It doesn't ultimately matter whether or not it's the capitalist ruling class or its state that is funding it, at least in the sense that the overall funding streams overlap and segue in various ways, and the objectives are fundamentally the same.
Now listen! Look, just real quick, at the long end of the list of atrocities committed by the Ford Foundation, I do have to add that really should be at the top of the list, is that they presided over the theft of my proposal by one of my former colleagues. And when I let them know, they just ignored me, likely with the idea, why would we give up having funded this, I think, $300,000 project just because this Jared guy showed us that his idea had been stolen by his colleague and submitted for this grant when it was done inappropriate, why would we do that? And of course, why would the institution give back the $300,000 just because my idea had been stolen? But I just had to throw that in there, because just at the long end of the list of atrocities, there's this little footnote where they we got Jared's money too. We fucked him over too.
We can. Why don't we put at the beginning of that, which isn't exactly the beginning, but Ford supported financially the rise of Hitler, and was
basically the same thing. We're basically saying the same thing. They supported Hitler and suppressed me. It's basically the same level of atrocity. I just want to make sure we're acknowledging this. That's all I'm trying to say.
I'm glad we're clear on that.
As long as we're clear. Exactly. It's, that's.
Yeah,
anyway.
I was just going to say one thing, follow up real quick. I mean, one of the jokes we have in filmmaking that constantly happens is documentary filmmakers in the bourgeois world. Well, we get foundation money. We're not on the open market, so we're thus more clean. Right. Yeah. And, we're not as restricted or something as you are in the open market, having to do, sell your movies, in the financial game in there. And I'm like, wait a minute, you're getting your money from foundations that have clear lines of what you can and what you cannot say. They fund certain projects and they don't fund certain projects. So that's part of the reason why I wanted to ask that question, because there is this conceptualization often that's lived for so long that foundations are the more ethical way for the artist to live.
So, I mean, so leads us to another one of my like overarching things is the rotating door, right? Between all the things. So you have the rotating door between the military and educational spaces. You have the rotating door. Like they're all, you know, there were so many moments as I was reading that I started really thinking about how government interplays with all of these different spaces, the media spaces, recognizing that CBS was always a problem, like the ongoing list of colleges and universities. And Jared, I don't know if you remember that like 2 years ago, Ricky threw me headfirst down that rabbit hole trying to understand the research, the quote unquote research programs that I don't even remember how many hundreds of colleges we discovered were getting research grants and military grants for research and DoD grants for research and working with the different military industrial complex pieces. So, you know, there were all these, you know, this movement between the system and these educational spaces. And, you know, Jared, I thought of you a lot when I was reading, because a lot of what within Gabriel's book he outlines about things like colleges being these spaces where they're just creating more bourgeois folks to continue to sell this idea that capitalism works, right? And so I kept circling back to these notions of how these things rotate. And then I started thinking about how lobby groups and government rotates. And so, you know, it's like this continuous spectrum of how all of these systems just kind of spin in circles in order to ensure that the system continues, right? And one of the things that I wrote down, and I'm going to figure out how to put this on a shirt, and you're quoting Mark Twain, but I just felt like it's such a good one. It's easier to fool someone than convince them that they've been fooled. And I was like, oh, ain't that the damn truth? But if you could talk a little bit about these rotations, right? These connections between media, news, academic spaces and government, and kind of how that lays a lot of the foundation for why culture is so, I don't even know what a good word is, by all the systems and the governmental structures that impact how it's presented to us as like this idea, like these are separate ideas when they're not really. I hope that question made sense. I said a lot.
Yeah. No, absolutely. One of the goals of the book is to demonstrate that knowledge, information, as it operates within the imperial world, is not some neutral zone of inquiry, but instead is highly regimented and controlled by very powerful forces in society, and that the so-called ivory tower does not exist. It's an institution of knowledge production and dissemination. Knowledge here I'm using very generally because it's also ignorance, right? It's uninformed knowledge, if you will. But this system is deeply embedded within the interests of the financial ruling class that ultimately own and control and oversee the means of intellectual production and distribution. Not only the universities, but we're talking about the publishing houses, the news and information platforms, all of the broader cultural industries that are operative in teaching people how to think and what to think. And it's not just the financial ruling class, it is also the state that plays a very direct role in shaping how these material institutions of knowledge production and dissemination function. Hence, as Jared mentioned a moment ago, the idea of the military-industrial academic complex. I imagine your viewers and listeners are familiar with the military-industrial complex that elucidates how the capitalist ruling class works hand in glove with the US government to advance its military agenda due to the permanent war economy. But the academy plays a really central role in all of this, so much so that there's, you could refer to it as a revolving door, just a breezeway between the two, where, according to the CIA itself, in 1975, they admitted to working with thousands of academics at hundreds of institutions. There's been no reform since that has changed that level of interaction. And some, including the author of Spy Schools, whose name is escaping me right now, assume that actually that number is now higher than before. So all of this, I think, is important because then we recognize that knowledge isn't a neutral element in society. It is a weapon of class warfare, and it is embedded in systems of power, so much so that the forms of even Marxism that are predominant within the imperial core and widely taught at the university are part of this broader intellectual world war that I was referring to, because they want to promote, and they have very explicitly promoted, both the financial ruling class and the US state, forms of Marxism that are opposed to actually existing socialism and that accommodate capitalism and even imperialism. So all of this, I think, is an invitation to my readers to not only think critically about the power structures of knowledge production, but to raise the most important question, and that is property and ownership, so that we can then engage in a true level of critique, not the kind of facile forms of critical theory that you get in the imperial core, but a resolute one that raises these larger questions of how it is that we leverage the means of intellectual production out of the hands of the financial ruling class and their material institutions and put them more squarely in the hands of the people. And I would say, in order to reference the very important t-shirt that Mtume is currently wearing, that one of the greatest threats, there are many of them, but one of the greatest threats posed by Cuba to the US state is that they have done precisely that. And they have one of the most developed and advanced intellectual traditions where they have made leaps and bounds in articulating a dialectical and historical materialist methodology and applying it to a whole series of different topics. And this form of actually existing Marxism far outstrips what you find in the imperial Marxists of the core. And they want to make sure, the financial ruling class and their state managers, that people don't have regular access, democratic access, we should also insist, to these forms of knowledge production, because they actually empower people to use knowledge not as a weapon of struggle against the working class, but for the working and oppressed masses of the world.
Go ahead, Jared.
That was I really appreciate that, and really just wanted, because your book starts, in fact, not only just talking about the Cuba, but the specific example of Che Guevara and what he represented, and in a very gruesome reminder of how he was dealt with, and I'll invite you to share some of that if you like. I did want to, if we, if everybody else is cool, I wanted to raise some more specific questions about the book specifically, maybe starting with this Che example. But I noted in my own list of things here that again, similar to, I think, one of the broader points of your book, when I went to the doctorate program in journalism and media studies, and I was identified by the administration as a so-called radical, their suggestion, their liberal friendly suggestion at the time was, Jared, you express a certain politics, you should really study the Frankfurt School. Like, that should be the wing that's your lane in graduate school. And I was like, okay. And I started running down the lane, and I was like, and whenever I saw, okay, I don't really, that doesn't, I just, nope, let me just, and kept running down the lane. So I love what you do here in exposing what people like me were suffering under and how it got to be that way, and maybe why it got to be that way. So if you could maybe draw that line for us and me that starts with the brutality of the waged against Che as an individual and what he represented, and then what maybe the Frankfurt School is institutionalized to replace, as I noted it in my notes. But anyway, yeah.
I appreciate that. And the book opens with this story of Che Guevara because I find that it is a great kind of microcosm of the intellectual world war in general. Most people are familiar with the fact that the CIA undertook an international manhunt to seek out Ernesto Che Guevara due to his threat to empire and to ignominiously murder him, and then also lie about a lot of the intricacies of this story. Fewer people are aware of the fact that the Central Intelligence Agency was also involved in trying to lay its hands on and control his literary estate and his intellectual heritage. And so that's how I open the book, is to demonstrate that the goal of the US empire has not only been to kill communists, it's been to kill the very idea of communism and to try to control how it is that people think about it. I won't go into all the other details about the various operators involved and the fact that this kind of intellectual world war on and around the legacy of Che continues to this day with his biographers and things like this. But it was also important for me to open with Che because of precisely what Jared just highlighted. I was not taught Ernesto Che Guevara in college and graduate school. Everything, quite honestly, that I read that was important for my real intellectual training was done in an autodidactic fashion on my own. I was never given the tools, you're right, to actually understand.
Message.
Which we should say, and here I will, criticize myself for being so ignorant. Of course, I should have known this, right? Why would the empire set up a system of intellectual production in which it would train people to fight and win against the empire, right? But when you're young, you assume that the older, more established people, prestigious institutions, they must know a lot more. And if you have humility, this is how you tend to go into it. I had a lot of humility. I also had the kind of class scars of feeling like I was an outsider, a hayseed from Kansas, didn't have the kind of elite upbringing and the training that a lot of the people that I ended up studying with did. And so for all of those reasons, I felt like, well, I just had to kind of play catch up. And when I got interested in Marxism, what was on offer? It was Western Marxism. In my case, it was the Frankfurt School for sure, but then also various forms of kind of postmodern, whatever you want to call it, neo-Marxism, post-Marxism, etc. Zizek, Badiou, Hart, Negri, all of these kinds of people as being the true radicals, the one who surpassed the limitations of old school Marxism and all of this. And what I've discovered through the course of my research is that it wasn't simply an individual relationship between like a young Jared or a young Gabriel or a young anyone else, and then these intellectuals, Adorno, Horkheimer, etc. There's actually a holistic system that explains how all of that is stitched together. And in the case of the Frankfurt School, since it's the focal point of the book, I'll just touch on one thing quickly and then turn it back to you. The Frankfurt School, when they were exiled in the United States, had more members working for the US national security state than for universities. And the passage through Washington was the springboard for their arrival at some of the most prestigious universities in the country in the post-war era. They also met a number of the managers of the foundations, Rockefeller in particular, who would then become collaborators. They became operators within the elite world of knowledge production, in which there is not a rigorous distinction between the state, the financial ruling class and its foundations, and the academy, Right? One great example of this is when Marcuse began working at Columbia and Harvard. This was for the first two area studies programs set up in the United States to study the Soviet Union. And these were Central Intelligence Agency cutouts, meaning that they literally took some of the research and analysis branch that was doing work for the US national security state and relocated them to Columbia and Harvard to continue doing the same work of producing state propaganda, but under academic cover. And Marcuse was still under State Department contract when he began his academic career. And all of his major publications, including all of his major publications, except for those that are like collections of lectures or later collections of papers, meaning publications that he put out himself, if you read through the acknowledgments, they were all vetted by former or current members of the US national security state or the propaganda apparatus, right? So we have to understand that Western Marxism, imperial Marxism, has been developed in such a way that it is a product of this kind of military industrial academic complex. The last thing that I would say, which is unfortunately very important because sometimes people fall into this kind of moralizing critique that consists in saying, well, there's nothing to be learned from these people. They're absolutely compromised. We should never read them and things like this. That's not my position. I've read almost, I think, the majority of what they've published, if not all of it, including archival work and unpublished work and all of this. I do believe that we should read them. We should also read, Hitler, and we should read John Stuart Mill, and we should, draw on all of the intellectual production of the capitalist world that we can, but we should read them and situate them and understand where they're coming from so that we can then make informed decisions about how we relate to them. And very importantly, we should not let the temporal imperatives of capitalist ideology make us spend more time reading Adorno, Horkheimer, and Marcuse than, for instance, Roberto Fernandez Retamar, Antonio Barrero Vázquez, or other Marx-Lenin Valdez, and other contemporary or recently deceased Cuban intellectuals who, as I was just saying a moment ago, give us a real version of anti-imperialist Marxism that far outstrips the imperial Marxism that's been complicit in various ways with the financial ruling class and the project of the US national security state.
And I'm sure your critics have gone into the archives and your footnotes and shown how you've mistakenly interpreted, for instance, Marcuse's lies, as I'm saying them after reading, in defense of his position with the State Department, just as an example. In other words, because it was such a disturbing read, even as I love the reveals. It's like, how are you? And then given his place in other spaces politically, that he would not only lie, but that the record is so, and then he's way involved. Like he was way involved. I'm sorry. It's crazy.
Yeah. No, thank you for highlighting that, because this research, it came out of about a decade of scholarly research, including archival research in physical archives, digital archives. I would say at this point, probably 120 or more Freedom of Information Act requests in order to get files on so many different people. And these are files, in Marcuse's case, his FBI files, 700, 800 pages? These are very long and detailed files. And all of this was important to me in order to dig as deeply as I could into this history. And saying critic is giving them a little bit too much credit. The compatible left intellectuals and publication platforms that have seen the title of my book and either not read it or disingenuously sought to misrepresent it have not, in a single case that I'm aware of, looked at any of the evidence in the archival record. None of them have said, oh, I engaged in all of this freedom of information, all these Freedom of Information Act requests. I went to the National Archives. I was at the Ford Archives, at the Rockefeller Archives, and Rockhill's just blowing smoke here. Nobody's even consulted the documents, that I have linked in the notes. And so if someone is interested in refuting the claims, that is where I've set the bar. I did not set the bar at the level of hot takes on Twitter by Radlibs or the compatible left publication platforms that they work for. What is important as well to note in the case of Marcuse is that, like, I reproduce, even in the appendix to the book, the 1948 State Department job description that says that he was in charge of providing intelligence to the Central Intelligence Agency. And I also very clearly articulate where I think certain researchers over time have exaggerated some of their claims, because there have been, I think, some even hysterical claims made about Marcuse. Thus far, I haven't seen evidence for some of the more extreme claims. And so it's not as if I'm just, making the strongest possible case that I can. I try to be as balanced and clear as possible, right? His relationship to Angela Davis is quite important. He did support Angela Davis, who was a member of the Communist Party, right? At the same time, there are complexities to the way in which Marcuse was radicalized, and he ended up remaining shy of support for forms of actually existing socialism, although he at least admitted that he was open to certain things in Cuba and China if they were going in a direction that was opposed to that of the Soviet Union. So he's always kind of hemming, and he's kind of qualifying his statements in various ways. But I think that it's important as well, and this is just pushing back against the kind of moralizing condemnation as opposed to a materialist analysis that looks at all of the evidence. And it's not just simply a matter of saying, well, someone's guilty. It's, well, what are they guilty of? To what extent? Did their views change over time? How can we make sense of this? And Marcuse was further to the left on certain questions than people like Adorno and Horkheimer. I mean, Horkheimer defended the war in Vietnam, and Marcuse didn't. And so it's also important to be able to see space within the imperial intelligentsia and say, well, if we have to choose between the two on the question of Vietnam, obviously Marcuse was taking better positions. But who was defending Ho Chi Minh and the right of the Vietnamese to self-determination?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Why was he
right?
defending? Why was he against the war in Vietnam? There's a left critique of an actual real critique of that, and then there's his version. So sorry.
No, 100%. You just said exactly what I was going to say. 100%. And so anyway, we just have to factor all of those issues in.
So, M2May, did you have a follow-up? No, okay. So I just want to quickly point out that everyone in the chat has noticed that when you mention people not like actually reading the book or following the threads that you laid out or paying attention to anything that you actually wrote, but just randomly like arguing against you without paying any attention to what you actually said, I think Jared almost like melted into his chair, because this is what happens all the time, right? And I get this a lot when I talk to people about specifically Black buying power and people who don't understand and haven't followed marketing and how this is all like this made up thing that like gets sold, right? And I have a couple of points in the book, and I'll have to like send Jared the pages where literally in the margin I wrote like MOBP. Like this is literally like this is.
I'm sorry. I got to say this though, because I've seen a number of people make this, and I really do appreciate the comparisons, and I do feel it. I do feel it and appreciate it, and I feel like I've suffered more than my fair share of nonsense from that. But we got to acknowledge, as I said in the chat a little while ago, there are levels to this. And while we have had some similar responses from some similarly situated politically reactionary spaces, the level of scholarship is the levels are cavernous between what Rockhill has done and what I've done. And I just want to be very clear. So the amount of work, Rockhill, that you've done, the level of exploration, the level of evidence you bring, the argumentation, the 10 years of work, all of that is very clear. So I just want to, I appreciate the parallels being drawn, but we also got to be also clear, like, in terms of the works
But
being criticized.
I want to be clear though.
Yeah.
The point remains that people argue with something that they have not engaged with in a real way that would allow them to make an argument that makes sense. It doesn't matter whether, to me, the differential in the work, you are both attacking two very different things. And to me, what Jared attacks is encompassed within what Gabriel's attacking in his book, right?
Yeah.
So that's where the differential lies, right? But the reality of the situation is people who don't want to recognize the very real situation that we are living in, our actual material conditions, which are created by the systems that are forcing us to live within these conditions so that they can continue to survive and thrive. People who are okay with those systems because they are doing well within those systems are eager to make these nonsensical arguments against actual documented, supported, here is the material that I read, here is the source where you can go to, and they'll just come back with some wild bullshit because they don't want to acknowledge that you made a valid point. So respectfully, Jared, shut up. Like, I'm right.
I'll double that without the shut up. I'll double on that without the shut up.
Jared's humility is a little much. I agree as well, but I think that it is like, I think what all of us are getting at is that certain political positions that Jared has taken, that I've taken, people and many others as well for that matter, people perceive as beyond the pale. And therefore, they don't feel like they even need to engage with it because it is not worth taking seriously. Now, what's quite fascinating about this is precisely one of the objectives of a lot of the psychological warfare campaigns that I study in the book. They don't want people to be seriously reading and engaging with forms of dialectical and historical materialist scholarship that thinks that socialism in the real world might be of some value. They instead prefer people to dismiss it as a kind of unreconstructed, Stalinist, orthodox, bloodthirsty, hellscape of who knows what other kind of outlandish things people will say, meaning that they try to reduce any form of scholarship to something that can just be slandered and dismissed. And one of the things that I find quite fascinating in my case from more of a sociological perspective is that the book has been subjected to a kind of compatible left dogpile, where it's almost as if every compatible left, not every, but a lot of compatible left intellectuals and publication platforms wanted to go on record almost saying to those who have read the book, what they're saying is us too. Like, we're the compatible left too. We too are policing the left border of critique, saying you should not read Rockhill. What he's saying is beyond the pale. And we should not take anything seriously. We should just denigrate him and reject him. What they're ultimately signaling to their audience is the ideological function that they play is in continuity with the compatible left intellectuals and publication platforms that I critically analyze in the book. In other words, they're doing my work for me. They're performatively demonstrating that what I've analyzed historically is alive and well today because the exact same rhetorical games, discrediting, slandering, straw person arguments, and attempt to police the left border of critique is operative around the book itself. The last thing that I'd say, I tell this story briefly in the intro, is that the book originally was censored by a kind of radical liberal left ish or lefty publication platform in France that's largely the equivalent of Verso Books. And the reason that it was censored is because I'd signed a contract and the book was set to come forth, but the final version of it had critical comments that were grounded in archival research that shed a negative light on figures like Hannah Arendt and Theodor Adorno. And the response that I got from the owner of the publishing house was that these are people who are like on our team or something like this. And therefore, meaning that they're of our franchise, meaning we've published them and we do not want to move down the market value of the commodities that we're pushing. Therefore, we'd rather censor your book and its claims based in material reality and verifiable evidence, then come to terms with our own history, publishing compatible left work. This is how a lot of the compatible left works, right? And functions. And so it's an interesting element to the debate around the book in general that I almost feel like, you know how some people say, well, I might not make this comparison, but I feel like I don't even have to intercede. I can just kind of stand back. And if people read my book and look at the responses, then they should clearly know, well, yeah, Rockhill's point is actually being made by the people who are attacking him without engaging in his book. So I don't really have to intercede in this debate because they're doing my work for me.
I just want to point out that was a loving shut up, everybody. It was a loving one.
Oh no, I thought we were basically ending our relationship and fighting for real. I thought we were canceling the podcast. You said something critical of me. We must hate each other forever now, I thought.
Exactly.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
But this brings another question forward for me, which is this term, the left, which we are always like struggling through. What does it mean? How do we define it? And there's so many versions of the left that come up within the book, right? Like we got the respectable left, we've got the new left, we've got the compatible left, we got the new, like, you know, and I am curious because I think for me, I almost struggle even saying it because so many people so quickly say, well, what is the left? Like, how do you define the left? What does it mean? What does it mean? And I wonder, given all of these different structures that exist within this thing that is the left, right? Are we pigeonholed? Like, are we creating a problem by using that term? Or is the issue that we are not correctly identifying all these factions within the left, and that we need to be more clear when we say the left, which of these folks on the left are we actually referring to? So people can address what you're saying in a way that is not applicable to all the folks who call themselves on the left, because there are indeed so many different factions within it.
I appreciate that question because part of what the book does is provide a counter history of the left in the sense that it elucidates how it is that we got to where we are, which is that we have the dominant left within the United States, Democratic Party and those adjacent to them, as well as in Western Europe and the imperial core more generally. That dominant left is pro-capitalist and pro-imperialist. That is a fake left that is against the historical heritage of leftism as it was understood within the revolutionary workers movement. And that is, well, if you're on the left, then you want a social and economic system that is in the hands of the people, not the financial ruling class. Therefore, you're in favor of developing socialism in the real world. You're against capitalism, you're against imperialism, and you're for real world socialism. That for me is a very clear distinction. There can be debates within that anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist left, how you do it, what the strategies are, etc. Of course. So it's still a pretty broad left, but the foundational orientation, I think, has to be toward the socioeconomic means of production, the base, and how you're oriented towards it. And what has happened with it's the impacts of imperialism, meaning the hyper development of the imperial core and the underdevelopment of the global periphery, what used to be called the third world, or many call the global south now, but also the material institutions in the imperial core, like the bourgeois state and the larger cultural apparatus, that have played an enormous role in shaping the left by first dividing it between the compatible left and the non-compatible left, thereby diminishing the power of the left in general, and then shoring up and promoting the capitalist imperialist left as the only left worthy of respect, the left that we could have a debate about, the left who would write a book and we would read it before criticizing, that kind of left. And when you make that kind of left into the only acceptable left, what it means is you banish beyond the realm of reasonable discourse a left that would say things like, well, maybe we should have a social and economic system in which there's health care that is provided for the people based on the value they produce in society, and education and housing and other such things. So that part of the goal of the book is to really intellectually reconnect the red thread to the real meaning of the left, and that is anti-imperialist and anti-capitalist, and in favor of socialism in the real world, which isn't a naive embrace of anything that's ever kind of waved the flag of socialism. It is instead an recognition that we do have the capacity in the here and now, because human beings on planet Earth have done it, to develop social and economic system that serves the interests of the people, raising literally millions of people out of conditions of abject poverty, backwardness, illiteracy, and giving them the capacity to lead a dignified human life. Human beings can do that because they have done it. And therefore, the left needs to be a left that is oriented towards that. And the last thing that I'd say is that this is not only essential to the human project, but we are now positioned in history in such a way that if we do not reinvent and rejuvenate the true left, then the conditions of possibility of human life and most forms of life on planet Earth are going to be annihilated. Therefore, it's not just socialism or barbarism, it's socialism or exterminism. It's socialism or lights out for humanity. So the stakes of rejuvenating a real left could not be higher. It's an existential question of life or death for the species.
Can I ask you an uncomfortable question?
Oh, I love those.
So there were a lot of points within the book where we talk about the lesser evil, right? And so, because I was mad at you a little while ago, because you made a comment about like voting for the person who was going to be easiest to organize under, which is, it's the argument about Democrats that it drives me crazy. And I didn't, it was a clip. So it's also part of the problem is sometimes they clip these things in a way that like, you don't really get the full context. So I want to clarify that because there may be some part of what you said that I missed. But I'm interested in how do we, in understanding fully what the stakes are, right? In recognizing and being fully clear on what is going to happen if we do not find a way to get the people to understand how duped they are, how much we're living underneath a system that is trying to convince us that we're not living in that system, that there's actually all these other things happening. How do we resolve this lesser evil argument, especially within electoral politics? And how do we find a way to move away from this idea that there is a lesser evil when they're all really on the same team and we're just not, right? Like you say it doesn't really have, it had nothing to do with electoral politics, but the way you phrased it reminded me of the same thing, which is promotion and repression are thus two sides of the same war of ideas. So when you have two sides of a thing, right? And they appear to be separate and opposite, but they're not. They're not at all. Like, they're the same thing, just like I like to call the Republicans and the Democrats two cheeks of the same ass. Shout out to George Carlin. But like, this is, to me, these are the same arguments. So I'm curious, how do we resolve this, right? Because it's something that I feel like, because people don't want to upset each other, they never ask these questions. And I think it's a question that needs to be addressed.
I appreciate it. And I might take a position that's slightly different than some of you. And I'm fine with people taking different positions when you agree on the basics. And I actually think it's really important so that we can have debates that are honest, good faith debates on the left to help us try to figure out how to move things in the direction that we need to move them. The first thing that I would say, and this is also just paraphrasing Lenin, is Lenin, regularly insisted on the fact that you're never going to have a situation where the communists are dominant and make a revolution. And so a purist politics that assumes that you could get the masses on board with your particular political project and advance that is practically naive. And what all of the great strategists, in my opinion, people like Lenin, Mao, and others have always articulated, is that you have to do an analysis of the extant play of forces and do it in such a way that you don't approach it morally based on what you want or what you aspire to. You don't project a kind of purism of what people should do. You look at where they are now and how to harness that power to move it not immediately to an ideal utopian future, but to move it in the right direction. And so one of the strengths of this tradition at a practical level is always insisting on the need for compromises, the need to work with reactionary organizations, the need to approach political questions politically and not morally. So it's not a matter of a subject and what they could possibly bear to do supporting one or another candidate. It's about looking at the overall play of forces and where you think you can push and make advances. The Bolsheviks, we know, one of their organizing strategies is they agreed to mobilize and go on marches with parties with whom they had fundamental disagreements. And they would often do this in such a way that they would agree to go on the march, and then they would use banners that were critical of the people that they were marching with in order to try to do two things at once, a kind of dialectical elucidation where they're saying, tactically, we're allied with these people for now, but strategically, this is where we're headed and they're not. So let's be very clear about this. So my own approach is always clarifying what our tactics are, our short-term steps, and our overall strategy. Given the fact that in the imperial core, we are dealing with a left that is predominantly compatible. That, I think, is just the reality. We need to fight against that. And ideologically, that's one of the struggles that I'm dedicated to. Obviously, that's a lot of what my work is on. But practically speaking, the approach that would consist of a person kind of on their revolutionary socialist soapbox saying the working class in the United States needs to agree with my principles and have this political orientation, I think is not going to get us very far because of the rank anti-communism that is very widespread in the country and the dominance of the compatible left. Therefore, I am of the camp, team, whatever you want to call it, that thinks that we have to find ways of tactically working with the powerful organizations, as corrupt and reactionary as they are. Not work with them in order to become recuperated within them, just do their bidding, become a sheepdog for them, but to look at where we can build power and where we have thus far been inhibited. On the political front of political parties in this country, we know all of the obstacles that have been set up for eliminating third-party options. I think it's very important always to look at the extant play of forces. What we need is a working class party that is of, by, and for the people. But what we have is two parties that are two different versions of pro-imperialist, pro-capitalist parties. So the differences between the Republicans and the Democrats are smaller than what they share, right? And that should be crystal clear. The strategy has to be overcoming a system in which they are the power sharers and the duopoly reigns supreme. And anybody who knows the history of the Democratic Party knows its history of complicity in a whole series of imperial crimes. You know, we could go on down the list. This then begs the question of, well, what do you do in the imperial core when there's not a powerful enough labor movement or socialist party movement to leverage power at an electoral level? One of the things you have to do is do local organizing and build up the power necessary so that you have the party structures that can do that. And that's unbelievably important, in my opinion. But you're also faced with a situation where, if it be local, state, or federal elections, you have to make decisions at a particular point in time. If your decision, for instance, is, I'm not going to vote because voting is just condoning the electoral system, what you're doing is precisely what the financial ruling class wants you to do. They do not want people to vote. The fight to vote has been part of the democratic fight for centuries at this point in time. They don't want you to vote. And so saying, I'm a purist, I won't vote, is doing exactly what they want you to do. Voting is not giving up on your moral integrity as a person. It is simply recognizing the political play of forces and making a decision at one point in time that there are certain candidates who would be incrementally better than other candidates. I do think, for instance, that if Trump were currently not in office, we would not be facing the situation we're facing in Cuba, in Venezuela. Not the same situation. There would be other draconian forms, but don't forget, Obama started to regularize relationships to Cuba. He was also the assassination president. He was overseeing an immigration regime that was more draconian than what you saw under Bush. You know, I have all the critiques of anyone else.
The bounty on Assad. You know.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. No, but when you see the broader spectrum, I think you have to ask yourself what are very difficult political questions. And that is it important within the imperial core to have incrementally better political leaders while growing political forces at a mass level and on the ground that could help, hopefully, push us in the direction of being able to call into question that larger duopoly? Or is it better that we either allow or foster what has been happening in this country for decades now, and that is a general shift to the right, in which you have increasing fascism on the right and the compatible left becoming increasingly close to right-wing positions. For all of those reasons, I don't think that the kind of lesser of two evils argument is, I think, a really simplistic one where Democrats just, come out in hordes and say, okay, well, if it's this one or that one, let's just do that one. That's not thinking in long-term strategic political kind of perspective. It's simply doing the same thing every 2 or 4 years based on elections. And so I don't support that. I also think it's very important in this kind of more materialist analysis, you've got to look at where power actually resides. It's always in the swing states. So if you're voting for a presidential election and you're in a swing state, that actually does matter to some extent. Voting in non-swing states gives you a different latitude for how you make your decisions. And I think those decisions have to be taken seriously. I do think that just to take an example that's parallel to this, some of the organizations that I'm close to that are working in France they take positions that are strategically oriented to a revolutionary transformation of society, but they recognize that the hard left is tiny, and therefore you have to make tactical alliances with social democratic parties, not because you believe in them strategically, because tactically, that's where the play of forces is at. So I'm in favor of strategic thinking, tactical alliances, and not the kind of moralism or purity approach that doesn't take these factors seriously. Renee, I don't know if your question obviously is quite vast, and others could disagree with me. I
do disagree with you, but that doesn't mean I'm right and you're wrong. It just means that I I still struggle with this idea that the incremental is actually better, right? Like, I don't know that a different version of invading Venezuela, a different version of invading Cuba, a different version, like, I don't know that it's better, right? Like, I just, and this is where I always struggle with these conversations, because I don't know if like, when people say like that's purity politics, right? I don't know that it actually in my brain is, right? To me, never voting for the person who is okay with killing off the entire population of Palestine, I'm okay with that type of purity politics. Like, I'm good with that. I really am, you know? And so it's tricky, you know?
The lack of genocide has never been on the ballot. It's never on the ballot in the US.
It's not, but that doesn't mean I have to vote for it. So this is where, you know what I mean?
Yeah, but voting isn't condoning. Voting isn't saying I agree with these politics. It's not a consumerist relationship of a subject to what I believe in or what I support. Voting in a bourgeois election is looking at the play of forces and deciding, well, in which case might we have, and might the global left, very importantly, particularly the victims of imperialism, a little bit more latitude. That's it, right?
And I wonder if that's actually the case. Like, this is and there's never a way to really know, right? So we can make all the presumptions we want to make about if things would be different under a Harris presidency, right?
Right.
But she's not president. So there's really no way to, like, there is no crystal ball that could definitively state, like, this is 100% what would be happening right now if Harris was president. There isn't.
No, we can't, but we can look at history and we can study things. And we know full well that the Democratic Party, nobody should have any illusions. They're not going to get rid of capitalism or imperialism or social murder or all of these things. They will, though, and they take slightly different positions on certain things that I do think are important. I'm not certain that Milei would be in power in Argentina, or that there would have been the decapitation strike against Venezuela. I'm pretty certain that there wouldn't have been a war on Iran in this capacity. I think the genocide in West Asia would have continued. So there's a kind of balance of forces. I mean, basically, the Democratic Party has a different strategy for maintaining U.S. imperial hegemony than the Republican Party. But those little differences can actually make an enormous difference, for instance, for 9 million people in Cuba. That can make a very, very big difference. And so one of the other risks, and Renee, I'm not accusing you of this, I'm thinking as well, because the positions I'm taking and articulating now are critical of positions that I took even, like, I don't know, 10 years ago or something like that. I do think that sometimes within the US left, there's a social chauvinism that ignores the ramifications for an increasingly fascist US foreign policy globally. And that doesn't recognize the extent of intensification that we're currently undergoing with Trump. You could look back at Reagan and say, well, if Reagan hadn't been elected, would the capitalist machinery have stopped? Would U.S. imperialism been halted? Would we? No, of course not. It's never on the ballot. It's not even a matter of that. But if Reagan hadn't been elected, likely the political situation in the United States and internationally would have been incrementally better in the sense of providing a little bit more latitude for progressive movements around the world. And I think that politics shouldn't be our focal point, right? In the sense that that's part of a larger political struggle, because the ultimate struggle has to be to radicalize, educate, and bring in the working masses in a country like the United States so that we can have parties. Some we already have. If it be, I could go down the list. We could do the Green Party. We could do the Black Alliance for Peace. We could do Frizzo. We could do the CPUSA and PSL and Workers' World. There's a lot of different parties, organizations, and formations that are trying to do interesting things that are beyond what we have within the Democratic and Republican parties. And that's extremely important. But we need to be able to consolidate and grow that power to the point of being able to have a more serious impact on politics. And if we're honest with ourselves, and you compare it historically, like, look at what the CPUSA was doing in the 1930s. They had some serious power. We're not there right now. So let's just be honest with the kind of power differential and figure out how it's not just a matter of like voting for one candidate and this is going to solve everything or anything like this. We need a series of tactics by which we can build the power and the working class organizations that we need, while providing space as much as possible domestically and internationally for progressive movements, because the stakes are that high. We currently have an administration that denies climate change, the scientific consensus. I mean,
well, but yeah, but a lot could be argued going back previous administrations that despite claims of paying attention to it, they also did fracking and nuclear proliferation, etc. So, but real quick, the most important point to your reference to the possibilities around the Reagan election is that had he not been elected, then his death during my wedding would have been inconsequential, and we would not have stopped to raise a glass. So let's just start there.
We always get there. We always get there.
We have to. I mean, I got to stay consistent. If the man's name
the humility and now this, I don't know.
I mean, no, I mean he died during my wedding, and which was officiated by the preacher Earl Neal who presided over George Jackson's funeral. So I like to draw those kinds of connections. Wow. It was a beautiful day, and we just celebrated our 22nd anniversary, by the way, yesterday. So, salute to us. But the problem that I have with the approach that I hear you articulating is that in the same way that you make the point that I'm compelled by, that we often in this country are not focused enough on what decisions we make here and how they impact other parts of the world less privilege. But going back to your point about the Bolsheviks, the problem that I have is that I don't seem to see the focus on that initial prior form of organization before engaging electoral politics that makes however that form takes more meaningful. So when you pointed out the Bolshevik example, that is a pre-organized group then engaging with a certain level of political clarity and consciousness. I don't see that here. What I see here is sort of a broad, what claims to be left, saying we can't develop parties, alternative blocks, anything. We just have to do the lesser of evil without, and I've saw some of the people in the chat making the point about our brother Diallo makes a similar argument that I do appreciate, that if you're going to engage the electoral political system here, even voting for the Democratic Party at certain instances, if it's done with a certain level of political consciousness and clarity, I could maybe be moved to it in a way that I'm not now. But that part seems to not get the focus. So what I like, and just to sort of reconnect it to what I appreciate about your book, is that as I'm hearing it, your book is advocating for a level of critique and an analysis and an engagement with real radical politics that prefigures an engagement both with those ideas in politics and even the academy in a way that I think we need to be organized politically before we engage electoral politics. And that part I don't see happening. So when we hear, it might have been slightly better under Kamala, or, Bernie could have done that. What those arguments seem to preclude are, let's first organize around a certain level of real left militant politics. Then if we want to come back and say, look, in this election, blah, 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 blah. Anyway, so that's where I'll stop there.
I appreciate that, because that resonates very strongly with my own politics, which is that we need this strategic horizon of our struggle to be crystal clear, right? It's not a matter of, I'm fine with having somebody who commits genocide in the White House. Like, that's not the strategic horizon of anybody's struggle. And I think that we all share that. Then it becomes the difficult question of, well, what are the tactics by which we get there? And I think that you're absolutely right that we need powerful organizations that are bringing people in, but also providing the necessary political education, because we do have to recognize that we have arguably the most indoctrinated population probably in the history of humanity, given the power of the psychological warfare operations that have been run by the United States. and that we are not in what Gramsci referred to as a war of maneuver. A war of maneuver, right, is when you get out of the trenches and you go for it because you're going to storm the Winter Palace or something like this. We're in a war of position in which you're digging trenches, you're laying the groundwork for future potential struggles. And right now, the left is, unfortunately, I think, so set back in this country that we do have a lot of the war of position to fight, which means that the cultural war, the struggle for political education, bringing people into organized politics, like building up the system of education, but then also just the organized network of politics in general is so essential to what we're doing right now. And elections, are an opportunity every 2 to 4 years to choose the member of the ruling class who you want to oppress you for the next 2 or 4 years. We have to be crystal clear about this. And so, Jared, also to your point, like the focal point needs to be on, the hundreds and thousands of hours between those seconds in which one would vote for a particular candidate. And those hours have to be dedicated to this difficult war of position and building power and education for a real left. And we actually have a real obligation to do that, because the greatest victims of this system are those in the global South who are subjected to levels of social murder that are truly, truly extraordinary. And given that the driving force behind, or I could even paraphrase here, Martin Luther King Jr., the greatest perpetrator of violence in the world today is the US empire, we have a particular obligation to do anything that we can to try to restrain that level of violence and social murder.
I appreciate it. And I, the goal was not to derail, and I don't think I did. I'm always trying to figure out, so how do we take the next step, right? So we see all of these things happening. We learn to recognize like where these pitfalls exist, to recognize, like, don't forget about the role that empire is playing within this. And if people cannot properly identify empire, identify imperialism, properly identify capitalism, and part of their arguments are leading you towards engaging within this system that is only elevating those things, that you have to put them in the space where you understand that whatever they're telling you is also being guided by their role and by their ability to capitalize and benefit from those systems, right? And so I'm always trying to figure out, like, I don't even know how to properly, like,
how do we make sure that while we're digging these trenches, the people that say they're digging with us aren't over there setting up some little wooded cabin with big windows on the lakefront? You know what I'm saying? Like, that's what I feel like is happening.
Exactly.
I'm with you, JB. I'm with you. And then you turn around, they over there.
And they're over there doing something different. And, you made a really, and it was so close to like the end of the book. I was like, oh, I love that he said, you pointed out a major difference between Marcuse, how I'm probably not pronouncing that properly, and George Jackson, right? And you did it on page like 316. So it was like almost at the end. And it was very clear, like, this is how you know the difference. Like, look at what happened between these two people, and that's how you know. But unfortunately, it happens, like, you don't know it until George Jackson is shot to death on the yard in San Quentin, right? And so, like, how do we get to this place of really preemptively recognizing those things? And I know it might be too complex of a question. Like, I don't know, and I don't know if I'm asking the question correctly, but I really want for us to have, like, this clear understanding that everything that we think is being sold to us as an individual, independent idea, all of these things are cased within a system that benefits by selling us this belief that these are independent and individual ideas when they are not actually, when they're actually being fed and walked through and cleaned up and edited and paid for by the very systems that are trying to prevent us from having individual and independent ideas. Am I making sense? Okay.
Yeah, no, 100%, because the way that bourgeois culture tends to operate is it creates an atomized logic of cultural production. It trains us that there are these great artists or geniuses who have their singular products, often telling us that they transcend history. They've made us feel ways that no other person could ever make us feel, or think thoughts that were beyond the thinkable. But from a dialectical and historical materialist vantage point, this is incoherent. Like, nobody lives in a vacuum. Nobody's isolated from collectivities. We're all products of circumstance in various ways, which doesn't mean that we're completely determined by them, but we're situated and conditioned by the material reality within which we exist. And the system that promotes all of this individual idiosyncratic work actually is also pushing a very coherent and quite standard ideology. In my own case, this was difficult for me to understand because, so I studied in France for about a decade and worked with some of the people there who are well known in the US. And when I first went, I thought, well, all of them are so different because that's what they all say. You know, they all have their own concept of difference, and it's different than anybody else's concept and more radical and deeper and all of this, right? Jared, you know this stuff. And so it's this kind of game of selling oneself as radically idiosyncratic, right? And moreover, French theory is considered within the academic world to be very distinct from Western Marxism, because French theory tends to be, questioning everything, all absolutes, kind of radical skepticism, whereas Western Marxism still defends reason at some level and the ability to elucidate material reality. But actually, when you look at the most important things, there's not that many differences between the French theorists, or between French theory for that matter and Western Marxism, because they all basically agree on the fundamentals. They all, to greater or lesser extent, obfuscate imperialism. They all, with almost no exceptions, and even the exceptions are explainable, they're hostile to actually existing socialism, and they describe it as worse than capitalism. And so they're all anti-communists. So ideologically, what we have is a very coherent consensus. And when you think of how consumer culture in general works, it makes perfect sense. Because in consumer culture, one of the things that you have is monopoly control over industries that are intent on creating the illusion of individual free choice in the market and a complete proliferation of products. So you can sit in front of the TV, or you can go online and you just zap endlessly, and there's millions and millions of channels, and it seems to never end, as if you had complete free choice. But you never find the channel that actually explains how the world works. You find all of these channels that don't explain it. And so part of the way that bourgeois culture operates is to create the illusion of difference in order to mask the kind of the univocal nature of the dominant ideology that pervades all of these different products. And so one of the reasons that I decided in this book and in its follow-up volumes to focus on the imperial theory industry is precisely to engage in a political economy of knowledge production that drills down to this level of analysis and says that, well, there's lots of different ways of selling the same basic ideology. So you have to see through the people who are hawking their wares and all of these different sophisticated products and recognize that at base, they're all telling you some of the basic things that are the same, which is that we should be against the people who've tried to make socialism in the real world, and that capitalism is as good as it gets. So the best that we could possibly do under capitalism, this is usually the payoff, is to maybe think otherwise, or to feel otherwise, or maybe read some, commodities from bourgeois culture, or go to some bourgeois films. Like, this is as good as it gets, really.
I just wanted to thank you for that, and I just wanted to shout out again that at the very beginning of your book, I mean, you literally call it the opening salvo of the intellectual world war. It includes a lot of focus on Edward Bernays and propaganda and this whole, and as he said, we will sell you presidents the way we sell you soap. It's like that. It's that whole approach. So, and in another interview that you gave, and forgive me, I know we're supposed to be wrapping up, but just quickly, you've in some one of the interviews I saw you in recently, you were talking about this point and your own situation at one point in your career, as you mentioned briefly. So, and you named some of these people. You worked with a lot of people. I even knew who their names were. I was like, wow, but you were talking about this in the context of fiefdoms being created. And then I even wrote it. How did you even phrase it? Fiefdoms and driving products that becomes something important in the academic world, where, by the way, I see a parallel in the activist community as well, even including this point about, I forgot how you just phrased it, but this intense individuality, got to find this exact little teeny tiny lane separate from everybody else. But yeah, because I don't know. Maybe that's it. Maybe I just wanted to shout that out and highlight it, and you don't have to say any more. But I did want to point that out about the propaganda piece, the relationship between consumption and the production of ideas and fiefdoms of intellectualism. There's so many bars in there. But anyway, that's it. Yeah,
I want to throw one thing just attached. I know we're closing up, because one of the things that I think, towards the end of your book, you talk about, DHM focusing on analyzing for practice, right? This idea that, we theorize to theorize and then leave it up in the air, right? But the actual, for revolutionaries, the job for theory is to practice it in the real world, right? And this kind of call to arms that I see that you're doing for intellectuals, whatever the spectrum that we want to put ourselves in, to be practicers and not just, sitting on the couch with the new idea.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The point that Jared made, I think, is important because, I ended up studying with some people who are quite famous, Jacques Derrida and then Alain Badiou. I worked with Etienne Balibar and some others, and took classes with a lot of the kind of famous French theorists. And it took me a while to figure this out, but it is very clear to me now that they're engaged in an intellectual practice that privileges exchange value and the promotion of their theoretical commodities. I mean, they're in the business of selling their work. And at one level, you could say, well, you're in capitalism. There's nothing wrong with that. Everybody has to, and that is true. Everybody has to find the material means by which to survive. But if the work that you're doing is peddling anti-communist work as Marxian scholarship, then you are really serving the empire in quite a despicable way. And if you study how a lot of these different intellectuals operate and the circuits that they move in, you recognize that they do function like a franchise, right? One of the reasons that some people are really pissed off at me is because of how well I was positioned within this franchise. I'm more credentialed, I think, than any of my critics, in the sense that, like, they don't have degrees with these people. They didn't work closely with them. And on top of that, I was positioned to be a kind of Anglophone acolyte of the leading French theorists. Like, my career path has been charted out because there's dozens and dozens of these people in the United States who I could point to who are doing exactly that. And that's how I got my job. I was hired because I was a specialist in French theory. That then in breaking with that, many people consider me to be like a renegade, an outcast, or something like that, because I said no to that system, but it also meant that I said no to all of the forms of control that are operative in keeping people in their lane, right? You need people to write letters of recommendation for you, for grants, for promotion, for applications for jobs, for anything like that. Those people don't exist for me because of the scholarship that I wrote. So I have removed myself from that system of power, and therefore I'm devoid of the type of power that comes with being an acolyte within a particular franchise, because the franchise is going to protect you, right? Just as we know on the Warhol industry, on in the financial sector, people are going to buy up Warhols because they have investments in Warhol, and they're going to protect the franchise. And so you have the same kind of, at a very different financial scale, of course, elements operative within intellectual franchises. But I know we're arriving at closing. For Mtume's point is that the reason for engaging in this theoretical critique of franchises is so that we can have theoretical practices that aren't oriented to shoring up one's career and pushing one's commodities on the marketplace of ideas, but instead collectively working with others to push in the right direction. And theory is a great guide, but it only serves its purpose if it's a guide to practical politics and struggle. And therefore, the ultimate goal shouldn't be theory for its own sake or for its exchange value, but theory for its use value, for orienting people in the overall class struggle. And, if we look back at the traditions that we've inherited, part of my own work is also carrying those traditions forward, because I didn't learn what I was seeking to learn, right? I come from a background growing up on a farm and working construction. I know what exploited labor looks like because I have an existential experience of that for years and years and years. And I wanted to find theoretical tools to combat that. But what the imperial theory industry gave to me was something else entirely, a way of leveraging up my distinction within the middle layer by learning fancy vocabulary and learning to question everything, including socialism or ideas like having a union or getting organized in a party. I learned skepticism, right? And so part of my goal, both individually and in the collaborative projects that I'm involved in, is making available the incredible collective resources that we have so that we can all learn from them. And so throughout the book, it doesn't only open with Che, but there are a lot of references. George Jackson, you brought up before, of course, Parenti's there, and Ludo Martins. And I mean, just the breadth and depth of this tradition boggles the imagination. There's so much to read and learn and study. And I want, hopefully, my work also to be a portal for people into that broader world so that we can kind of, if people have been trained in Western Marxism or French theory, they arrive at the kind of switchboard operator where you say, well, that path, you can study it if you want, but it's not going to lead very far. If you switch and you look at the anti-imperialist Marxist tradition, there you're going to be given the tools necessary to inform yourself about how the world works so that you can meaningfully affect change within it, thereby maximizing your agency, thereby empowering yourself, not only as an individual, but empowering yourself to be part of something greater than yourself, which is the struggle on the part of humanity to develop a social and economic system that serves people and preserves the natural world. That, I think, is a project worthy of the greatest dedication, and something that can be something not only that we believe in, but something that we can materially make if we figure out the ways of fighting and struggling together.
So I know we have to end, and Jared has his mic off, but I like for Jared to end. So because he always does the end part. So just give me 2 seconds, Jared, and then I'll shut up, and then you can take over. And then, but before Ntume, do you have anything? I want to make sure I give you space.
No. I'll have to
Okay.
find another time to get Gabriel back on within our
Well,
case.
we yeah,
We'll have another
and I
conversation.
do hope that Gabriel enjoyed this conversation as much as I did, and I can't wait to call my mother when this ends, because I feel like she's gonna be like chomping to talk to me about all the stuff that we went through. And I hope, Gabriel, that you'll come back at some point in the near or future or whatever have you. There's still so much that I'm taking in. I'll have to rewatch this. There was some questions about Joy James's book on Angela Davis, to know if you had read that, to see if you had any thoughts that I'd love for us to kind of talk through in the context of the people who do get lifted up, that we're still trying to figure out, like, where are these people really, like, in like, where, when we go back, if we go up 50 years, where are these people going to actually be situated, like, in this current time that maybe we're not aware of right now? Are these people the things that we think they are? There's so many pieces of this, but I really I learned so much from your book, and I'm so appreciative of you said 30 years of work, and I wrote like 30 years, like the amount of time and work that you put into compiling all of this knowledge into these pages so that people can get so much of this historical context, so much of this understanding of dialectic materialism, so much of the history of how all of these systems are interplaying with each other to just mess us up. And I really appreciate it. And I wanted to make sure that I said that out loud, because I don't know if I actually clearly stated it before we got started.
It's super kind of you, very generous. I appreciate it. And the goal in the work, of course, is to have it contribute to the collective project. And so what all of you are doing is so important. And I'm a collective animal, so I'm more than happy to collaborate in, whatever shape that takes in the future. And I really appreciate the support and just the kind of good faith engagement with the scholarship, which is so important for just having kind of adult conversations about the work, if you will.
I just want to also echo the congratulations on the book, and echo the sentiments about what I've learned from it. And I want to one more time encourage everybody to not only get the book and read it, but to continue to engage in Gabriel's interviews, particularly with Mtume, Millennials Are Killing Capitalism. There's a number there's a lot actually out there of hearing Gabriel talk about this book and various elements of it in different perspectives. And so please, everybody, continue to engage, and we will definitely look forward to more with you as well around here. There's a lot more I'd like myself to raise with you at some point. So real quick, thank you, Old Grease, for the super chats and the support and the love for the anniversary. Yeah, it's great. And again, everybody, please like, share, subscribe, support the Patreon, do whatever you can to support this platform. Check the book and all the associated platforms that I've been mentioning and represented on screen. And as always, peace, only if you're willing to fight for it, as Fred Hampton used to say. And we'll catch you next time around here next week with more. I did the wrong button. With more Saturday with Renee.
Black Liberation Media is a collective of Black and African organizers, journalists, academics, and media personalities serving Black and African masses seeking to further grow in their understanding of themselves, their histories, and the African world through entertainment and news. Please continue to like, subscribe, and donate to the channel so we can further serve you and liberate our people. You can also go to blkliberationmedia.org, get some merchandise, and also become a Patreon member and a member from the YouTube. Please do what you can, share, and show your love as we will show ours for you. Black Liberation Media.